Well, it is 2 p.m., so we are going to go ahead and get today started. Hello, my name is Rebecca Hassan, and it is my distinct pleasure as this dissertation chair, as the chair of this dissertation committee, to be introducing Mr. soon-to-be Dr. Tiwa Ajibewa. But first, let me give you a brief background about Tiwa. Tiwa received his bachelor's degree in biology and French from the University of Minnesota, then continued his education at the University of Iowa, where he worked with Dr. Gary Pierce, examining the role of anxiety on vascular dysfunction. There he received his master's degree in health and human physiology. And in 2016, Tiwa joined our laboratory and had a particular interest not only in understanding cardiovascular disease outcomes, but identifying disparities and identifying the root causes of those disparities in cardiovascular diseases, as well as developing innovative solutions to help prevent and eliminate those disparities. As a health disparities physiologist, Tiwa was very much interested in disentangling the relationships between environmental stressors, such as socioeconomic inequalities and racial discrimination, and how they contribute to differences in health outcomes. But it was immediately following his doctoral comprehensive exams where Tiwa identified a new stressor, a salient stressor, and an almost universal stressor that was receiving less attention in the disparities literature, and that was weight-based discrimination. I can remember it like it was yesterday when Tiwa barged into my office telling me about his new research interest. And it was in that conversation that he gave birth to his dissertation questions. And I knew in that moment a scholar had been born. But not only is Tiwa an emerging independent scholar, he is a productive and award-winning scholar. While here at the University of Michigan, Tiwa has published 13 papers and 5 of which are first author. Just last month, he received the Graduate Student Writing Award from the American Kinesiology Association, and he's received numerous travel awards to present his research at the American College of Sports Medicine and the American Psychosomatic Society annual meetings. Tiwa's not only, his excellence has not only been evident in the laboratory, but it has also been witnessed by his students in the classroom. In 2008, Tiwa received the School of Kinesiology Teaching Award, and in 2009, he received the University of Michigan Rackham Outstanding Graduate Student Instructor Award. But Tiwa will be the first one to tell you that he did not achieve these accomplishments all by himself. He had all of you encouraging him, working beside him, helping him to cross the finish line where we are at today. I would like to personally acknowledge Tiwa's family, Mr. and Mrs. Ajibewa, who are here today, Tiwa's friends, church members, lab mates, all who encouraged Tiwa over these last 5 years. And I would like to acknowledge his committee members who are here today, Drs. Robinson, Sonneville, Miller, and Dr. Toledo Corral, who have helped to sharpen Tiwa's research skills and scholarship over the past couple of years. So without further ado, I introduce to you Dr. soon-to-be Dr. Tiwa Ajibewa, who will be presenting his dissertation entitled A Psycho-Biobehavioral Expansion of the Cyclic Obesity Weight-Based Stigma or COBWEBS Model in Adolescents with Overweight and Obesity. Tiwa, if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen now, I'll just do a few procedural things right now. So what we will be doing is we will allow for questions in the chat box. So if you can put your questions in the chat box after Tiwa finishes his 40-minute presentation, we will take questions from the audience, and then the committee will ask their questions in a separate breakout room.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hassan. If you wouldn't mind enabling screen share, I'll get started on my defense and presentation today.
You should be all set now.
All right. Excuse me. Okay. Let me just. All right, so can everyone see the screen? Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Hassan, for that wonderful introduction Like you said, I didn't make it here all by myself. It's been a village. And so I really appreciate that introduction, as well as everyone who's came on this Zoom call today. It would be awesome if we can meet in person. Unfortunately, given the circumstances, that doesn't allow. Nevertheless, I really appreciate seeing everyone's faces here virtually, as well as just even already seeing some of the comments in the chat as well. So thank you all for coming. As I start my presentation today, I would like us just to all take a brief moment to reflect back, to think back, and to even imagine back to your adolescent years. If you are anything like me, your adolescent years were filled with joy, but they were also filled with certain types of stressors. For me in particular, I remember vividly back to when I was in high school, and I would go to stores like Marshall's and Target with my mom, and I would ask her to buy certain brand name clothing in order for me to fit into certain social circles at school. So fitting in was something that was really challenging for me. Like a good mother, however, my mom oftentimes turned down that request. And so I would then raid the closets of my two older brothers and then often wear their clothes to school in order to fit in. For other individuals, it may be that some of the stressors that you imagine or even think back to related to academic pressures, maybe even to interpersonal conflicts and bullying, or even to sort of stress that comes from increased self-consciousness as a result of, this transition period from childhood into adulthood. For adolescents with overweight and obesity, they not only face some of these commonly seen stressors, but they also face stressors that deal and that relate with their weight status. In particular, adolescents with overweight and obesity often face increased weight-based teasing, rejection, bullying, and even stress from their family members as it relates to their weight. There's also increased self-consciousness that may happen as a result of this higher weight status that they may have, as well as there's evidence to show that there's increased physiological stress that is seen as well with heightened responses from the HPA axis. So with all of this said, it really is important to highlight the fact that weight-based teasing, devaluation because of one's weight, or even unfair treatment because of one's weight is actually very common. It is commonly seen in media, it is commonly seen in movies, and like I mentioned a little earlier, even within families, there's increased pressure and there's stigma that is perpetuated by family members. It's also commonly seen within the school environment. Teachers actually point to weight-related bullying as one of the most problematic issues that they have within the school. Individuals with overweight and obesity are often depicted as being lazy, unpopular, unintelligent across different sectors. And so with all this said, it really points to the fact that weight discrimination and weight-based stigma is really a stressor for individuals who are experiencing it. Evidence within the stress literature really points to the fact that this increases stress, decreases one's ability to self-regulate, and elicits even increased physiological stress responses is seen with increased cortisol within many of these studies. One of the researchers that's really done a great job in helping us understand how weight-based stigma, weight-based discrimination really is a stressor is Dr. Janet Tomiyama. Dr. Janet Tomiyama is a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and she put forth and created this cyclic obesity and weight-based stigma model that really helps us to understand how stress from weight-based stigma really leads to increased weight gain. And so within this model, she puts forth that individuals who are experiencing obesity, stigma, weight-based stigma have increased psychological stress. This psychological stress then manifests itself physiologically through increased cortisol. Oftentimes, individuals who are facing this stressor have and cope with their stress by increasing their eating. This together with the increased cortisol then leads to increased weight gain. And because these individuals are gaining weight, they may experience more and more stigma as a result of their weight and or may even internalize the stigma, which then further leads to this cycle of weight begetting more weight. And so as I was looking at this model, I was, like Dr. Hassan said, sort of just amazed at how she put together all of this literature and really created this model to really help us understand how stress really leads to weight gain among individuals who are experiencing this salient stressor known as weight-based stigma. However, there were some questions that I had and that I really wanted to answer. And first of which is whether or not this model can be applied to adolescents. Additionally, as a kinesiologist, as someone who studies physical activity, I was amazed and shocked to see that physical activity wasn't actually included in the model, and felt the need and the importance of adding and thinking about how stress really influences physical activity as well. In addition to that, another question that I had was, what were the roles of constructs that underlie eating and physical activity behavior? Constructs that I'll later talk about, but that include things like enjoyment of physical activity. I also wanted to ask a question about metabolic risk factors that go beyond simply weight gain. Risk factors that may precede weight gain or may come after weight gain as well. Lastly, one of the questions that I had was also to really understand what the role of behavioral intentions are. If you're like me, I often have intentions to be physically active, right? I want to go and exercise and play basketball, but given the day-to-day grind and the stress of life, sometimes those intentions actually never come to pass, and I find myself actually not exercising or doing the things that I want to do. And so with that said, it really this is one of the reasons why I had this question. And so I wanted to expand the COBWEBS framework to really address these questions, and the aims of this dissertation really go about doing that. The first and second aim of my dissertation is really looking at the role of stress on both eating behavior as well as physical activity behavior, and seeing whether or not these constructs, that underlie some of these behaviors, whether or not that alters or changes the relationship between stress and eating and stress and physical activity behavior. In addition to that, my aim 3 was really looking at these risk factors that I mentioned, particularly risk factors that relate to type 2 diabetes. And so wanted to really look at the role of stress on insulin sensitivity, as well as stress on visceral adiposity, given some of the work that we've seen and know about the role of cortisol and how that influences metabolic health, particularly visceral fat in particular. And then my last aim 4, was really getting at these behavioral intentions. So looking at how weight stigma and stress from that really affects and influences physical activity intentions as well as dietary intentions. So you may be asking, why are these questions really important? Why should we answer these questions? And the truth is, if we really want to understand weight gain, it's important for us to add physical activity to this model. In addition to that, given the cyclic nature of the COBWEBS model, it's also important as researchers to really answer questions that directly disrupt the cycle at different points in time. Particularly, I'm asking the question and really examining aim 1 and 2 in order to be able to understand how, as researchers, we can be informed to disrupt this cycle earlier within the framework. Additionally, disruption of the cycle later in the framework is also important. Really looking at the role of cortisol and the biobehavioral pathways that may influence weight gain. Answering these questions for aim 3 really helps us to get at that a little bit more. And then lastly, again, disrupting this cycle early on is of utmost importance. And so recognizing and really answering questions as to how stigma and stress from stigma influences intentions is also important. So just delving straight into my first aim here, I really wanted to answer or examine the association between psychological stress, the enjoyment of physical activity, as well as physical activity behavior, and the effect of enjoyment of physical activity. So I was really trying to get at how stress influences physical activity and how enjoyment of physical activity could possibly alter that relationship. And so there's lots of work that really supports this inverse association between stress and physical activity participation. Work done by Steptoe and colleagues really went about and found that increased acute stress during an examination period actually led to decreased physical activity among individuals who were facing the stress of that examination versus those who weren't. In addition, pilot study from our lab, actually a study that I was part of, we found that increased chronic stress actually predicted lower moderate to vigorous physical activity among adolescents. And then there's been work that's been done in adults as well that's really shown that increased stress is associated with decreased physical activity engagement. But there's work that still needs to be done, really looking at moderators of this relationship, factors that could possibly alter the role of stress on decreasing physical activity. And one of such factors is physical activity enjoyment. Physical activity enjoyment is known to be a predictor of physical activity participation. In a study that was done by Kinsey and colleagues, where they had a group of adolescents, they asked adolescents what was one of the main factors for you to be physically active during the time that you were. And 62% of these adolescents mentioned that it was the fact that they enjoyed the activity. Additionally, there's been work that's really been done that shows that, physical activity enjoyment and the enjoyment of physical activity is actually associated with greater time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So this is health enhancing physical activity. And physical activity enjoyment in of itself is one of the most prominent predictors or the most key predictors of sustained physical activity over time. And among adults, there's work that's really shown as well that increased stress is actually been shown to be associated with lowered physical activity enjoyment and lowered satisfaction as well. And so with that said, again, I really wanted to look at the association between stress and physical activity enjoyment within AIM 1. I also wanted to see whether or not psychological stress was associated with decreased moderate to vigorous physical activity and total physical activity participation. In addition to that, I wanted to see whether or not the construct of physical activity enjoyment moderated that association. I hypothesized that increased stress would be associated with decreased physical activity enjoyment, and that increased psychological stress would also be associated with decreased moderate to vigorous physical activity, as well as total physical activity participation. For this study and for this AIM, I used a sample from 2 different data sets. The first data set was the Stress, Obesity, and Diabetes in Adolescents study. And so this is a study that was conducted within the Childhood Disparities Research Lab, led by Dr. Rebecca Hassan, where the study really aimed to examine the interrelationship between psychosocial stressors, such as psychological stress, social stressors, and how they then influence type 2 diabetes risk in adolescents with overweight and obesity. I also took data from the Health and Culture Project. So this is the HCP project that was also done within our lab, which really examined the social, cultural, and psychological predictors of obesity in adolescents. With regards to study measures, physical activity was measured using accelerometry. So we gave the adolescents accelerometers to take home for a week, and then we had them bring back the accelerometers, and we considered a valid day to be a day where they accumulated at least 600 minutes of physical activity. In addition to that, we made sure that each of the adolescents had at least 4 valid days, and that we considered to be generally valid for our study inclusion. With regards to physical activity enjoyment, this was measured by self-report using the PACES questionnaire, the Physical Activity Enjoyment Survey, and this was done self-report, as I mentioned. Psychological stress was also self-reported using the commonly used perceived stress scale. So this is a scale that was created by Dr. Sheldon Cohen that really assesses one's perception of their ability to cope with the stressors in their lives over the past month. So now moving on to our results. When you think about the participant characteristics, we had 110 participants, or I had 110 participants within the study. I just wanted to quickly highlight two main things here. The first of which is the physical activity enjoyment. So this scale goes from, I believe, 16 to 80. And as you can see here, that the mean score for our sample was around 64, essentially suggesting that most of these adolescents had a relatively high enjoyment of physical activity. However, when you look at the actual physical activity participation, we see that that physical activity participation is actually relatively low. So the CDC recommends that adolescents, have on average 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day. However, as you can see here, moderate to vigorous physical activity was much lower than that at 12.3 minutes per day. So there seems to have been a disconnect between the enjoyment of physical activity and the actual participation in physical activity within the sample. When I examined sort of the association between stress and enjoyment, I found a significant association where increased psychological stress was associated with decreased enjoyment of physical activity. However, there was no association between stress and objectively measured physical activity within the sample, nor did physical activity enjoyment really modify the association between stress and total physical activity, or MVPA. So in conclusion, it really seems as if stress was associated with lower enjoyment, but not actual physical activity participation. And so it is my belief that it really looks as if stress is exerting more immediate effects on psychological factors. So, this psychological factor enjoyment that precedes physical activity and engagement. And so with that said, I think one of the key implications is, as researchers, as stakeholders, as parents even, one of the things that we should target is the enjoyment of physical activity, and do that through increasing the fun factor of being physically active. Too often, physical activity is sort of mentioned in the domain of just simply exercising, going out and exercise for your health alone. And we sort of lose that sort of play aspect of physical activity, particularly among younger children. And so finding ways to increase the play and the fun factor is something that I think is really important for researchers and other stakeholders to help with regards to this. In addition to that, there's been some work that we've done previously in school in Detroit, Michigan, where we found that when we put in this concept of gamification, so using game-like designs within our impact intervention, that it actually increased moderate to vigorous physical activity participation by 27% within our sample. And so again, it really goes to show that we really need to consider the enjoyment and target enjoyment and increasing the fun factor when it relates to this within school environments and elsewhere. And so just to revisit our guiding questions for AIM-1, really when you look at physical activity, we found that there was no association between stress and physical activity. However, when you look at enjoyment of physical activity, there seems to be something there, right? In the sense that enjoyment actually didn't modify the association between stress and physical activity, but enjoyment is decreased as a result of increased stress, sort of getting at the fact that maybe this increased stress is really influencing enjoyment more than physical activity. And because of that lowered enjoyment, it may in the long term influence physical activity participation. So moving on to my second aim. So for this second aim, I wanted to examine the association between acute stress, caloric intake, and the moderating effect of disordered eating behavior. So very similar to AIM-1, but on this side, this time looking at the energy intake portion of the energy balance equation versus the energy expenditure portion. So there's work done by Dr. Lissa Epple and colleagues that really sort of show and have demonstrated that most individuals, between 60 to 70% of individuals, increase or otherwise maintain food consumption during times of stress. However, there's a subset of individuals who decrease or otherwise maintain food consumption during periods of stress. Work that we've done from a pilot study from our lab, really when we brought in adolescents with overweight and obesity, and we sought to see whether or not during a period of stress that they would eat back some of the, they would either eat to cope with the stress that they were facing or not eat, we actually found that following the laboratory stressor, that adolescents with overweight and obesity actually didn't stress eat. And the laboratory stressor that we use might be familiar with some of you, and that's the prior social stress test that can be seen there in that depiction. So given that these adolescents didn't actually stress eat as we would have hypothesized, it really sort of had us asking the question, or had me asking the question, what other factors may be at play here? And one such factor is disordered eating behavior. Disordered eating in of itself has been shown to be increased as a result of increased stress. Increased stress has also been shown to be associated with increased binge eating, loss of control eating, increased bulimia. And pilot work that we previously published also shown, we found that in a group of adolescents with overweight and obesity, that greater psychological stress was associated with increased dieting behavior among them. However, there were no differences by race or ethnicity, nor were there any differences by gender. And so this really goes to show the salience of stress and how that really impacts eating behavior, regardless of regardless of race, ethnicity, or even gender. Oftentimes, we associate disordered eating with certain race or ethnicities or with certain genders. And the truth is, disordered eating, particularly in the domain of being stress and disordered eating, that it seems as if it's something that doesn't sort of discriminate regardless of stress or regardless of race, ethnicity, or even gender. And so with my second aim, I wanted to really look at the association between psychological stress and caloric intake, and then also looking at whether or not disordered eating behavior modified this relationship. I hypothesized that increased psychological stress would be associated with increased caloric intake, and that disordered eating behavior would modify this relationship. Again, for this aim, I used both the combined data sets from SOTA and HCP, just as I did for aim 1. Study measures, caloric intake was measured using the Youth and Adolescent Food Frequency Questionnaire. And so this questionnaire really asked about eating and drinking behavior over the past year. Stress was measured using the Acute stress, daily stress inventory. And so this is a 58-item self-reported inventory that measures frequency of stressful events over the past 24 hours, as well as sort of the total sum of these events. And then disordered eating was measured using the commonly used eating attitudes test. And so this is a scale or a survey that really assesses eating behaviors and attitudes around eating. So again, as we look at the participant characteristics, I really wanted to just highlight a couple things. First of which is the acute daily stress. Both acute daily stress and actually the total acute daily stress were relatively low, in the sense that acute daily stress ranges from 0 to 58 with a maximum score of 58. You see here that the mean score for our sample was actually 18. So they had about 18 events that caused stress over the past 24 hours. In addition to that, total acute daily stress, or the sum total of these stressors, was much lower than the highest possible score as well. So for me, it really just sort of spoke to the fact that maybe the daily stressors that these adolescents were facing weren't really high, but at the same time, what you'll realize with our results was that yet, even with those lower ratings of stress, that stress was still associated with increased caloric intake, as we can see here. So total stress from these daily stressors was associated with increased caloric intake. Additionally, increased acute stress frequency was associated with increased caloric intake. And then lastly, when I looked at the moderating effect of disordered eating behavior, again, we see that total EAT score, so that was the disordered eating score, moderated the association between acute daily stress frequency and caloric intake, with higher intake among adolescents who had higher disordered eating scores. And so just to summarize, it seems as if acute stress was is really playing a role in increasing caloric intake among our sample. Adolescents with higher levels of disordered eating in particular may be at risk for increasing caloric intake during periods of stress, as we saw in the moderating effect of disordered eating. And so the implications of this study really, to me, it sort of is getting at the fact that we really need to find critical and multi-pronged approaches to help adolescents who are dealing with increased stress in their lives to deal with it in a healthy manner so that they don't go back and cope via increasing their eating. This is particularly important given the increasing mental health challenges of the 21st century. Even when we think about the COVID environment, there's sort of increased challenges that come along with that, as well as just easy access to unhealthy foods that are often in many of our neighborhoods. And so to revisit the guiding questions for AIM 2, really focusing on the role of disordered eating, we found that first and foremost, that stress was associated with increased eating behavior and caloric intake, and that disordered eating behavior really is playing a role here, as we saw with the adolescents with higher disordered eating behavior being particularly at risk. And so to move on to AIM 3, which was focused on really examining the biobehavioral pathways that link stress to metabolic risk in adolescents with overweight and obesity, I wanted to really see whether or not stress was associated with these type 2 diabetes risk factors, these risk factors that can either precede or come after increased weight gain, and whether or not that went through a behavioral or biological pathway. So cortisol, one of the most well-known stress hormones, is released from the adrenal medulla as the end product of a hormone cascade that starts in the hypothalamus with the release of the corticotropin releasing hormone when an individual is facing stress. And so cortisol is known to increase visceral fat accumulation. We also know that cortisol inhibits insulin-dependent glucose uptake within the muscle, and that over time in chronic disease state or in chronic stress states, that cortisol also increases the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And so with that said, I really wanted to sort of examine the association and the role of stress on some of these type 2 diabetes risk factors, insulin sensitivity, visceral adiposity, going and examining whether or not this association went through a cortisol pathway as I've described in the last slide, or whether or not this went through a behavioral pathway that included physical activity and food intake, as we've seen in some of the other aims that I had previously. I hypothesized that increased psychological stress would be associated with decreased insulin sensitivity and increased visceral adiposity. However, I also hypothesized that this association would go through both a cortisol pathway, a biological pathway, as well as the behavioral pathway linked with physical activity and food intake. For this aim, I strictly used the SOTA dataset for this sample, as opposed to using both the SOTA and HCP dataset. Insulin sensitivity in this study was measured via the intravenous glucose tolerance test. So we had participants come into the Michigan Clinical Research Unit after a 12-hour fast, where we collected blood. So we collected, I believe, 14 blood samples over the times listed there. So essentially, we had them come in. We gave them a glucose bolus, and then we watched as both insulin and glucose influence changes in their blood samples. And so we gave them a glucose bolus at time point 0, and then an insulin bolus at time point 20. And you can see via both of these graphs the influence of both glucose and insulin on the different concentrations within the blood. In terms of visceral fat, so for visceral fat, we used a proxy measure, an indirect measure of visceral fat called android fat mass. And so in this case, given that the DEXA machine or the DEXA doesn't really give visceral fat measures, we wanted to find a proxy measure, and this was the best measure that we had. And so for this, again, this was measured using a dual energy X-ray or X-ray absorptiometry DEXA. And so participants underwent scans using standard imaging protocols. And for participant characteristics, I wanted to again sort of point out one key finding here, or one key characteristic, and that was really the insulin sensitivity characteristic. And so if you see the mean insulin sensitivity here for our sample was 2.74. And so generally speaking, a number near 2 or below 2 would really sort of point to the fact that these adolescents were insulin resistant. And so for the majority of our sample, they were either near insulin resistance or were insulin resistant. For our results, found that psychological stress was not associated with insulin sensitivity or android adiposity. However, increased cortisol was associated with greater android adiposity. And as I mentioned, this is an indirect measure of visceral fat. So this is consistent with some of the literature that's been done and even published by Dr. Hassan, Dr. Toledo Corral. And in addition to that, I wanted to sort of look at whether or not there were racial differences, given some of the work that's been done in the literature that it's shown that Black or non-Hispanic Black adolescents have sort of higher stress exposure within sort of the built and social environment, stress exposure through things like community violence, for example. And so I did post hoc analyses looking at racial differences, and I actually found very interesting findings there, and I can mention and talk a little bit about that during the question and answer session as well, if you would like. So revisiting some of the questions that I had for AIM 3, really looking at whether or not metabolic risk factors were influenced by stress in this case, found that that was not the case. And so with that said, moved on to my fourth aim, which was really examining the association between weight stigma exposure and health promoting behavioral interventions. This study is something that might be in some of your minds already, given the fact that weight stigma has been on the news. It was on the news with relation to the incident that happened between Bill Maher. So Bill Maher, a late night TV show host, made some comments that essentially was saying that fat shaming and weight stigma needed to make a comeback as a means of having people lose weight. James Corden, another late night TV show host, actually came back and said, that's not how things work. And fat shaming and weight stigma actually, as we've seen, oftentimes leads to increased weight gain. And so this was all over the news. It was on Time Magazine. It was on Newsweek and USA Today, and even on CNN as well. And so this is something that's been seen in the news, talked about in the news, and even within the scientific literature has been explored as well. And so when we think about weight stigma and how it sort of gets under the skin and causes increased stress, there's been lots of work that's shown that weight stigma sort of it gets under the skin and causes stress in part through a social identity threat. So social identity threat, for many of my psychologists, they already know that it's based off of the social identity theory, where essentially individuals who are facing or experiencing stigma, they may embody or otherwise internalize some of the negative judgments of others. This then in turn leads to increased stress. Weight stigma as it relates to eating behavior has been shown to alter eating behavior. Work done by Dr. Rebecca Poole and colleagues actually found that among adolescents, that many of these adolescents responded by saying they cope with this weight stigma that they experience by eating. Other studies have shown that weight stigma is associated with unhealthy eating behaviors. And as it relates to physical activity, weight stigma has also been shown to lead to greater likelihood of avoiding physical activity or avoiding physical education class. And even among older adolescents and college-age students, prior weight stigma experiences have been associated with increased avoidance of physical activity as well. And so for my study, and this study was the study that I started as a principal investigator. This study was titled The Attitudes Regarding Eating and Activity, or AREA study. And so for this study, I really sort of looked at whether or not weight stigma exposure was associated with eating intentions and physical activity intentions as well. And I also examined whether or not prior weight stigma experiences were associated with these same outcomes. I hypothesized I hypothesized that those who had been randomized into a weight stigma exposure group would have increased eating intentions, as well as increased physical activity avoidance and decreased positive physical activity intentions. With regards to prior weight stigma experiences, I hypothesized that increased prior weight stigma experiences would be associated with increased eating intentions, increased physical activity avoidance, and decreased positive physical activity intentions. So for this study, we, myself, along with some of the undergraduate RAs, we went and recruited participants ages 18 to 21 from the University of Michigan student population. We had them come in, we had them first fill out an online survey, and then we randomized them into either a control group or an experimental group. And then we had them watch the videos that were associated with those two groups and then complete more surveys. And we also gave them accelerometers, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So we started this study in January of 2020, but just like everyone else, study data collection was upended by COVID. And so we fortunately had to stop data collection, but fortunately, we were able to have 49 participants complete both study visits 1 and 2, which, you know, again, just is a testament to the hard work of some of the people that I work with. And so when we think about the experimental conditions, there are 2 different conditions, as I mentioned. There was a stigma condition where the participants would come in and then they would watch movie or TV clips that would depict individuals with overweight and obesity in a stereotypical or derogatory ways. And then for the control condition, we had participants come in, and rather than watching the stigma video, they would watch these emotionally neutral clips, clips from insurance companies or even from insurance commercials and Blue Planet clips as well. And this was the control group. And so these videos were have been previously used by weight stigma researchers. And I actually got the videos from Dr. Natasha Shvay, who herself is a stigma researcher. So with regards to the study measures, prior experiences with weight stigma was measured using the stigmatizing situations inventory. And then this measures prior experiences with weight stigma, and then physical activity intentions, both positive and avoidance of physical activity was measured using the positive physical, the self-reported and exercise intention scale, as well as avoidance motivation scale. Eating intentions was measured using the eating intention scale seen there. And so participant characteristics here, I wanted to just briefly point out the fact that the majority of our sample was generally female, and then prior experiences of weight stigma were relatively low. So with regards to our results, we found that greater experiences of weight discrimination was associated with avoidance of physical activity. But when I looked at sort of prior weight stigma experiences and some of these positive physical activity intentions and eating intentions, there was no association. And then when I looked at differences across conditions, there was also no association or no significant differences across conditions for these outcomes. And so in summary, it seems as if higher prior weight stigma experiences are associated with increased physical activity avoidance, which is in line with some of the work that's already been done by Dr. Poole and colleagues. Eating and physical activity intentions also did not differ by group, and prior weight stigma experiences did not predict physical activity intentions or avoidance. And so it really points to the fact that maybe there needs to be more longitudinal studies really examining the effects of weight stigma on behavioral intentions and actual eating and physical activity behavior. And so getting back to our questions for this, it seems as if physical activity intentions are being influenced by weight stigma. However, dietary intentions aren't really, in our case, being influenced by weight stigma. And so just to summarize the significance of this dissertation, I believe, is really unique in the sense that it combines several different fields, such as psychology, health, behavior, and physiology, in order to help us really understand the role of stress on weight gain. It expands our understanding of stress and its influence on weight gain, really looking at not just the health behaviors, but the behaviors that underlie such behaviors, or constructs that underlie such behaviors. And it also informs future interventions in the sense that it addresses upstream factors such as enjoyment of physical activity, avoidance of physical activity, and it really points to the need of having and creating novel approaches by which we address stress that adolescents are facing. And this includes using physical activity as a healthy coping strategy. And so for future directions, you can probably already see the fact that that upper left corner doesn't have anything in it. And so future directions really points to the fact that longitudinal studies are really needed among adolescents with overweight and obesity in order to fully even understand and comprehend whether or not this expansion of the COBWEBS model is really getting at what we're thinking it's getting at, and whether or not we can really intervene at those different junctures that I mentioned earlier. And so with that said, I would like to acknowledge my dissertation committee. They've been sort of vital throughout this whole process. Dr. Hassan in particular has been just an amazing mentor. One of the things that I've recognized and realized throughout my time, both at Michigan and elsewhere, is that there's really a distinction between an advisor and a mentor. And Dr. Hassan has really been both of those to me. And she's always been someone who's gone above and beyond, someone who's sort of, always had my best interest at heart, someone who's allowed me to be a researcher with my own interest, and has really given me the tools to be able to pursue those interests. As you can tell, our lab really doesn't really look or examine weight stigma, right? But she's allowed me, given me the freedom to be able to do that. And so I really am just indebted to Dr. Hassan for all that she's done for me over these past 5 years. In addition to that, I want to acknowledge the rest of my committee members: Dr. Allison Miller, Dr. Leah Robinson, Dr. Kendra Sonneville, Dr. Toledo Corral. Each and every one of my committee members have they've had and made an imprint on this dissertation in one way or another, and it's always been positive. Dr. Miller always, it's like she sprinkles a bit of genius on all the papers that we've written. And Dr. Leah Robinson, if it wasn't for her, some of the work that I did with my fourth aim, I wouldn't have done. I didn't really talk about it today, but I also looked at physical activity behavior, and it was because of her that we even decided to include that. And Dr. Sonnenville, from the onset, after I reached out to her via cold email, and she was just very gracious. The first time I met her, we talked about the weight stigma. We talked about sort of fat shaming and all of those type of things. And she's always sort of been patient with me as I've learned to sort of immerse myself within that literature. And Dr. Toledo Corral as well has just been very integral as it relates to some of the work that I did for AIM-3 as it relates to sort of type 2 diabetes risk. Again, she's just like everyone else on the committee, has just been incredibly gracious. Every time I reach out to meet, even though she's on the West Coast, she wouldn't hesitate to meet with me. And so lastly, I just want to thank the Michigan Clinical Research Unit for helping us collect some of the data that I collected for this dissertation. Also thank study participants and their parents, as well as our funding sources there. Particular shout out to Rackham Merit Fellowship for funding me throughout these 5 years. And then last but not least, I want to thank some of the people who've helped me to get thus far. First and foremost, for folks who know me, and that faith is a huge part of my life, and there's a famous saying within church circles, and that saying is, God is good all the time, and all the time God is good. And personally, God has really been good to me throughout these 5 years and beyond. I'm thankful first and foremost to my Lord and Savior for that, because He's given me strength throughout these 5 years. These 5 years they've been amazing. They've had many ups and many downs, but God has been good through it all, and I'm just first and foremost thankful, and give all the glory to Him. And I also want to just thank my family, my parents. Sometimes my parents didn't really know, what the PhD entailed, but they would always be praying for me, always reaching out, sending Bible verses, etc. And my brothers as well. I made a joke earlier that I would raid their closet for clothes. And my brothers they've been role models for me in every which way. And everything that you see about me or can point to and say is a good thing about me is really stemming from my family. Told myself I won't cry, so I'm trying not to cry. I also want to just thank, Dr. Janelle Goodwill. She was a very important part of my PhD process and this journey, just being able to be PhD students together, her always encouraging me and helping whenever I had any issues with, say, Stata or anything else. It was just, I really, really appreciate that, as well as the kinesiology staff members, Charlene, Ruloff. There's a reason why everyone, when they do their dissertation defense, always has a picture and acknowledgement of Charlene, and that's because Charlene truly is the real MVP. And so thank you, Charlene. Thank you to kinesiology staff members, kinesiology faculty members as well. Dr. Pete Bodery, Dr. Horwitz, Dr. Armstrong, and many others. Just really appreciate you guys, Dr. Cole Bianchi, and as well as some of my colleagues here in kinesiology. Dr. Hassan mentioned that I won a couple of teaching awards. And honestly, I won those awards, for two main reasons: the students that I had, as well as the colleagues that I had helping me as I would run into some issues with the equipment. And then I would always reach out to Mike Schley, Mark Padicky, and they would never hesitate to come and help out. And also thank my other colleagues, Dr. Erica Twartzik, Dr. Jenja Jong. We used to call ourselves the dream team, and those two are just like, there's amazing researchers and friends, and so I really appreciate you both. And to other friends, Jubilee, Daniel Vigneault, my Morris crew, you guys know who you are. My Morris professors, my French professors, particularly Dr. Sarah Buchanan. When I was applying to grad programs back in 2013, I would always send her personal statements, and me and her would go back and forth, and she would pair it up, and she would help me really sort of refine and fine tune my personal statements. And so thank you to Dr. Buchanan, to Dr. Leah, to Dr. Burberry, and so many other folks. And thank you to the CDRL. The CDRL has been a family for me over these past 5 years. Each and every alum and alumna that's come through this lab has played one role or another on this dissertation, and I really just want to acknowledge that. So, and also lastly, I'll be remiss if I forget some of these folks, because they'll come back and say, why didn't I say, and acknowledge them? But I want to acknowledge, Grace Adofuli, Mrs. Ngia Franklin Porter. If it wasn't for these two, I wouldn't have even considered grad school. My RCF crew, H2O crew, et cetera. Really, really, truly appreciate you all. So with that, open it up for questions. And again, thank you all for coming.
Tiwa, we're all air clapping for you right now. Congratulations on a wonderful talk, and thank you for sharing your research with all of us. There are a couple of questions, and we do have a couple of minutes. They are in between all of these congratulations, but I will read out a couple of the questions. And for individuals who are sending more questions, feel free to inbox me directly, and that will be easier for me to find your questions. But the first question is asking about, you piqued their interest about racial differences. So Tiwa, since you said you would be interested in talking about that, what were some of the racial differences that you found in your AIM 3 questions?
Yes, that's a very good question. And let me just quickly think. I'll just go to the slide actually. So here's the slide. So with regards to racial differences, so I really looked at the outcome of insulin sensitivity, and I wanted to see the association between stress and insulin sensitivity by race. So I used and did analyses where race was the moderator, and so looking at the moderating effect of race. And I found that among non-Hispanic white adolescents, when they had increased psychological stress, that they had sort of better or greater insulin sensitivity. And the opposite was true with non-Hispanic Black participants. So with increased stress, that these Black adolescents actually had decreased insulin sensitivity. And so it really sort of, it, it got at the question of like, what is really going on here? Because, we can't necessarily see these findings and then say, okay, let us increase the stress that our non-Hispanic white adolescents are facing in order to improve their insulin sensitivity. And so it was just an interesting finding, particularly for the non-Hispanic white participants. The Black participants, this is something that was what we hypothesized and what we believed. But I think really what's happening with both of these samples is really that other influences are sort of at play here. I think, for example, with the white participants, maybe they have greater social support, and social support has been shown to help improve type 2 diabetes risk or improve insulin sensitivity, in the fact that, for example, it might, with increased social support, you and friends might go out and play basketball more often, be physically active together more often, et cetera, which may have influenced that, right? As well as sort of stress appraisal. Stress appraisal could have also influenced these findings. And in addition to that, sort of the stress exposure that these adolescents, both Black and white adolescents, are facing. We only measured psychological stress, but there's other stressors within the social and built environment as well.
Excellent. So another question that we have from the audience is from Brianka, and she asked, I noticed you use the acute stress inventory. Did you find any other stress inventory or psychological battery that would have aided in your research and its aims?
Good question, Bree. So I only use the daily stress inventory. There are other measures of stress that we could have looked at. There's an adolescent life stress questionnaire. There's several other stress measures that I could have, maybe not several other that I could have looked at, but adolescent stress was one of them. I didn't look at that. There's discrimination, maybe looking at that as a stressor. I could have looked at that. So there are other ones that were available that I didn't look at, because I really just wanted to get a sort of general view of, acute stress. And I figured the daily stress inventory really gave me the best insight into that.
Mm-hmm. You have another question that's talking about the variability in your data. So they say, great talk, Tiwa, excellent research. But I noticed that the standard deviation for some of the data, for example, the frequency of stress are quite high, almost as high as the mean for some of the data. What are the implications of this for the studies? Do you expect the standard deviation to increase if the number of participants are increased or stay the same? So you have a stats question here.
Yeah, that seemed like maybe two questions there. So the last question will actually, can you repeat that question again?
So I'll give you the first question and then you can answer that, and then I'll give you the second question. So the first question is, for some of the data, when we're looking at the frequency of stress, so I think this is in reference to AIM 3, your question 3, the data are the standard deviation is quite high, almost as high as the mean of some of the data. So what are the implications of this for your studies? That you have a lot of variability in your data.
Yeah, so the good thing, I would say, the implications, one, we would like the variability because that sort of helps us understand, the variability is good generally speaking, because you wouldn't want just a sample that's like not necessarily variable. But the implication, I would say, is it's not as I don't know how best to say it's sort of refined or really sort of getting at, I guess the implication would be that you would want to maybe in some ways standardize, maybe not standardize, but at least make the gap less wide in terms of variability. But there's the implications with outliers, right? I think that's really what that's getting at. And so there are some outliers, and so you want to find ways to sort of deal with that. And with increased sample size, I believe that was the second part of the question. I think with increased sample size, that would really I would believe sort of help with some of those issues, and sort of, and again, if there was outliers, maybe help us deal with finding the reasons why those outliers were there.
Good, good. Well, it is 3 o'clock, and so we are out of time, but I want to thank everyone for their attendance today. What we're going to do is that the actual dissertation committee is going to meet in a breakout room. So Tiwa, we will give you 10 minutes to continue talking to your family and friends out here, get powered up for the second round where you'll have individual questions from your committee. In 10 minutes, you can join the breakout room. We will leave this call open for when Tiwa finishes his firing squad questions. Then we will introduce Dr. T to the audience.
Firing squad questions.
Thank you again for your attendance, and we will see you all shortly.
Thank you all for coming.
Tiwa.
Hey.
Congratulations, Tiwa.
Woo! Good job, Tiwa.
Congratulations.
Bravo, Tiwa.
That
Am I supposed to be in here?
I went on a leave there. Everyone was being so enthusiastic. It was so fun in there.
Leave group. So
Yeah,
I'm supposed to
you should
leave
go
this room.
back.
Okay, okay.
Mm.
Okay, so hold on. Where is?
Yeah, Leah. Gang's
Oh,
all
there's
here.
Leah. Okay. So Claudia request. Oh, hold on. Let me stop.